Welcome to today's story. Have you ever wondered what a person's true worth is made of? We often measure our lives by the things we can hold, the titles we carry, or the properties we claim, completely missing the invisible currency that actually shapes the world around us. The story you are about to hear is about a quiet soul who spent her entire life tallying up everything she lacked, completely unaware that someone else was keeping an entirely different account of her true value. It is a tale of shifting perspectives, silent kindness, and the sudden realization that what we think makes us empty might be exactly what makes us full. If you enjoy this kind of content, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts. We post videos every day. Please leave a like on this video if you enjoy the story, and let us know in the comments where you are from and what time you are listening to us. Part 1. The Invisible Ledger. Sadie Miller looked down at her own empty, calloused hands. Hands that had known nothing but endless labor under the harsh sun, and Sadie sighed, and Sadie finally spoke the heavy things she had believed about herself for as long as her memory could reach. The evening wind swept across the vast Montana plains, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust as she stood before the one man she dared to care for, trying to push him away for his own perceived good. I have nothing to offer you, Wyatt. Nothing at all. No land, no money, not $1 to my name. And no family name worth much of anything either, she told him with a painful, quiet certainty. She gestured toward the sprawling pastures that rolled toward the horizon, outlining the reality of their differing stations in this rugged frontier. You are a man with a large, thriving ranch. You could easily marry a girl who would bring you good, fertile land and a fine, respectable dowry, she continued, her voice steady, but laced with an undeniable sorrow. I would bring you absolutely nothing. But myself is not worth much on any practical account I have ever seen in this county. Wyatt Hayes simply stood there in the fading amber light of the Montana evening, perfectly still, and calmly listened to Sadie Miller tally up all the material things she did not have to her name. And when Sadie was finally done laying out her profound lack of wealth and standing, Wyatt Hayes did not immediately argue with her about the practicalities of land or the necessity of money, largely because Wyatt had long ago learned that there was absolutely no use in arguing with a stubborn number. Instead of confirming her deepest insecurities, Wyatt Hayes smiled a slow, incredibly sure smile that reached all the way to his eyes, and Wyatt said in a low, resonant voice, "Sadie Miller, you have the kindest heart in all of Montana, and I have been keeping a close count a good deal longer than you might think." He took a step closer, erasing the physical distance she was trying to put between them, and shook his head gently. "You say you have absolutely nothing to offer. I have been quietly watching you offer vital things to everyone in this entire county for 2 straight years," he told her. "Sit down right now. I am going to read you back the careful account you never even knew anybody was keeping on you." Sadie Miller was a 25-year-old woman whose life had been defined entirely by grueling physical labor. Sadie was merely a ranch hand, a profoundly poor one at that. An orphan girl who had been taken in at a very young age and raised exclusively to work the harsh land. And Sadie owned, in all the vast and unforgiving world, exactly what she stood up in at that very moment, along with one old, delicate blue shawl that had once been her mother's. Sadie had spent her entire existence absorbing a painful lesson, being told in 100 small, dismissive ways by the local townsfolk and her foster family that a woman who brings nothing tangible to a marriage is unequivocally a woman with nothing of value to offer. And Sadie had completely believed it, internalizing the cruel mathematics of the frontier, the exact way you naturally believe a fundamental thing that absolutely everyone around you unanimously agrees upon. Wyatt Hayes was 29 years old, a grounded and observant man whose family owned a highly profitable, sprawling ranch in the rich valleys near the town of Bozeman, and Wyatt was the sole heir who would inevitably inherit all of it. And Wyatt could have, exactly as Sadie had accurately pointed out, easily married any number of well-bred, affluent girls from the surrounding territories who came with hundreds of acres of prime land neatly attached to their respectable names. Yet, the simple truth was that Wyatt Hayes did not want any of those wealthy, proper girls. Wyatt Hayes wanted Sadie Miller, the impoverished orphan hand with the chronically empty pockets and the worn blue shawl, and Wyatt had fiercely wanted her for a very long time, Harboring this deep affection for a specific reason that Sadie had never once suspected or even imagined was possible in a place like this. Because here is the fundamental, beautiful truth that this entire narrative revolves around. Sadie Miller had been rigorously keeping one specific kind of account of herself for her entire life. A depressing, highly detailed account of absolutely everything she lacked, meticulously listing her total absence of money, land, dowry, and social standing. And according to that strict, unforgiving account, Sadie genuinely believed she was worth absolutely nothing to society. But Wyatt Hayes had been keeping a completely different sort of account, quietly and diligently observing her for 2 full years, maintaining a mental ledger of absolutely everything Sadie so freely gave away to those around her. And by Wyatt's specific, deeply observant account, Sadie Miller was undeniably the single richest woman in the entire territory of Montana. Here were 2 entirely distinct ledgers kept on the exact same person, evaluating the very same life through completely opposite metrics, and they had never once been read side by side, compared, or brought to light until this very night under the sprawling western sky. It was a monumental clash of perspectives between a woman who saw herself as entirely empty and a man who saw her as overwhelmingly full. So, as we trace the origins of this quiet romance, it is essential to deeply remember these 2 contrasting accounts and the history that forged them. Remember Sadie's deeply ingrained ledger of absolutely everything she did not possess, the harsh, critical one she had wholeheartedly believed and measured herself against for her entire life without question. And remember that somewhere out there, hidden in plain sight all along, a remarkably quiet, observant man had been steadily keeping a second, beautiful ledger, silently noting it down entry by specific entry of absolutely everything Sadie Miller gave to the world around her. To truly understand the profound weight of what Wyatt Hayes read back to Sadie that transformative evening, you have to clearly see the individual entries in the exact same way he first saw them unfold. So, let me take you back through the rugged years of their youth and directly show you the hidden, compassionate account Sadie never even knew was being carefully kept by the man who loved her. Sadie Miller's mother, tragically, passed away when Sadie was merely 6 years old, leaving a permanent void. And Sadie's father, a drifter by nature, was never much in the picture to begin with, completely vanishing soon after. And so, an isolated Sadie was raised from the tender age of 6 by the Lawson family, a stern group of folks who ran a brutally hardscrabble, unforgiving spread deep in the valleys, and who took the young Sadie in much more as an unpaid hand than as an adopted daughter. The Lawsons were not overtly or intentionally cruel to Sadie in a malicious way, but they were deeply impoverished, incredibly hard-pressed by the land, and fiercely practical. They made it abundantly clear to Sadie, very early on and quite often, that she was strictly there to earn her keep through sweat and labor, and that a young girl with absolutely no people to rely on and no inherited property had best learn to work tirelessly, because backbreaking work was the only currency she would ever have to trade on in this harsh world. Sadie learned that brutal lesson all the way down to her very bones, absorbing it into her posture and her daily habits until it defined her existence. Sadie worked relentlessly from the exact time she was physically large enough to walk behind a heavy iron plow, and over the years, Sadie naturally grew up to be exceptionally strong, remarkably capable, and incredibly quick-witted in the fields, ultimately becoming a much better, more reliable hand than most fully grown men in the U territory. Despite all this immense labor and skill, Sadie owned absolutely nothing at all in the world except the simple, faded clothes on her back and exactly one small, delicate thing more. The one single thing more that she possessed was a worn, finely woven blue shawl that had once belonged to her late mother. It was the only physical remnant Sadie had of her, the absolute only thing in the whole wide world that was truly and undeniably Sadie's very own possession to keep. And Sadie had kept that precious garment wrapped incredibly carefully and hidden away in her modest quarters for 19 long years, treating it with utmost reverence, and she wore it exclusively on quiet Sundays, or during the most bitterly cold winter nights. And that faded piece of fabric was, as one might accurately say, the complete and entire contents of Sadie Miller's worldly estate, her sole treasure in a life devoid of material wealth. Remember that delicate blue shawl as we move forward through her days. Like absolutely everything genuinely precious and meaningful in these types of profound stories, it ultimately comes back around exactly when it matters the most to the people involved. Now it must be understood that Sadie grew up in a harsh, practical country where a young woman's fundamental worth, especially when it directly came to the business of marriage, was reckoned plainly, strictly, and spoken out loud without any polite hesitation. A girl who brought fertile land to a new marriage was universally considered a perfectly fine catch by the local families. A girl who brought actual money and capital to invest in livestock was deemed an even finer one by the ambitious ranchers. A girl who brought a deeply respected, good name, and a highly respectable family lineage behind her was always viewed as someone entirely worth courting and pursuing. And a girl who tragically brought absolutely nothing to the table, having no land, no money whatsoever, no recognized name, and completely no people of her own to back her up, was, in the brutally plain and unforgiving arithmetic of the frontier country, not considered much of a viable prospect at all, entirely regardless of whatever exceptional personal qualities she might secretly possess. Sadie, always quiet and present in the background, heard this exact, cruel arithmetic calculated aloud her whole life. Sadie frequently heard the Lawson women casually sitting around the hearth, ruthlessly discussing the realistic marriage prospects of all the local frontier girls in exactly these strict, transactional terms, constantly adding up their respective dowries and acreages exactly like mathematical sums. And Sadie, quietly listening from the shadows while mending clothes or preparing meals, inevitably did that exact same cold sum on her own life, and the depressing calculation always came out precisely at zero. So, logically protecting her own heart, Sadie Miller had firmly decided, long before a prominent man, like Wyatt Hayes, ever looked at her twice, that she was definitively not the marrying kind of woman. This heartbreaking conclusion was certainly not because she did not deeply want a warm home and a loving family of her very own to nurture. Sadie actually wanted those exact things fiercely, desperately, in the deeply private, agonizing way you intensely want things you have already strictly decided you can never, ever have. But Sadie had rationally done her societal sum, and her unyielding sum was always zero. And so Sadie had quietly made her lifelong peace with permanently being a reliable hand for other people's families, rather than ever becoming the cherished heart of her own. It was absolutely not out of self-pity, and Sadie never once wept about it or complained to anyone. Sadie simply and completely believed it, exactly the way she unquestioningly believed the sun came up every morning, accepting it as a plain, immovable fact of her earthly life. Thank you so much for listening up to this point. It truly means the world to have you here with us following this beautiful journey. What do you think is going to happen next? Will Sadie finally realize her own immense worth? Or will she successfully push Wyatt away forever? Please leave a comment below with your predictions and let me know your thoughts. And remember, if you are enjoying this story and want to hear more just like it, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We post new videos every single day. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Wyatt Hayes and about the deeply profound ledger he had started keeping, although he certainly did not call it that and did not even quite know he was doing it at first. Wyatt Hayes was the strong, capable son of a prosperous ranch owner, and by every practical reckoning of the Montana Territory, Wyatt was considered an incredibly fine catch himself by all the local families. Wyatt would inevitably inherit hundreds of acres of good, fertile land, and because he was naturally well-liked and respected, for years the ambitious county mothers had relentlessly steered their marriageable daughters toward him. These were the girls with the substantial dowries, the prime land, and the highly esteemed good names, the girls who mathematically added up to find perfect sums in the eyes of society. And Wyatt had surprisingly found, to his own internal puzzlement, that not a single one of those affluent girls genuinely interested him at all. There was always something identically hollow about all of them, a distinct sort of cold calculation hiding just beneath their polished charm, a persistent sense that they had already done their financial sum on him, exactly the way he was supposedly expected to do his calculated sum on them, making the whole business a sterile matter of matching one grand estate to another. And then, roughly 2 years before this particular evening's story actually starts, Wyatt Hayes had quietly begun to deeply notice Sadie Miller but certainly not in the calculated way he was forced to notice the wealthy dowry girls. Wyatt truly noticed Sadie because of a very specific, quiet thing Sadie consistently did that Wyatt simply could not stop thinking about once he saw it. It was a seemingly small, insignificant thing to the rest of the world, but it was the very first monumental entry in the invisible ledger Wyatt did not even know he was starting to carefully keep, and to genuinely see exactly why it mattered so much. To Wyatt, and why it was only the first of many beautiful entries, you absolutely have to understand that Wyatt Hayes had spent his entire privileged life being exclusively valued for what he materially had. He had never once, until he started closely watching Sadie, actually seen a person being valued solely for what they selflessly gave away to others. Sadie Miller was about to inadvertently teach Wyatt Hayes an entirely new, deeply beautiful way of adding people up and measuring their worth. He just did not know it quite yet, and neither did she. The absolute first entry in Wyatt Hayes's secret ledger was a man known simply as Old Silas. So let me briefly tell you the heartbreaking story about Old Silas, because he ultimately matters significantly more than a minor background character usually does in these types of frontier tales. Silas was a frail, weathered old ranch hand who had loyally worked the harsh Lawson spread for 40 long years, but he had tragically grown far too old and far too sick to manage the grueling physical work anymore. In the incredibly hard, unforgiving arithmetic of the frontier country, an old, broken hand who could completely no longer work was viewed strictly as a massive burden, merely a hungry mouth without a pair of capable working hands attached to it. Because of this cruel reality, Old Silas had been quietly and unceremoniously moved out to a dilapidated little shack at the very far edge of the Lawson land, left there to live out his final, agonizing months more or less entirely forgotten by the world. Absolutely nobody ever visited Old Silas. Nobody claimed to have the spare time for a dying man who could no longer be useful. That was simply how the cold reality went in those harsh parts. Absolutely nobody ever visited Old Silas, except for the quiet and observant Sadie Miller. Every single evening, after enduring a completely full day of the absolute hardest, most exhausting work on the sprawling ranch, when Sadie could have easily and rightfully rested her aching bones, Sadie walked all the way out to Old Silas's drafty shack and patiently sat with him in the dim light. Sadie always brought him whatever meager food she could quietly spare from her own modest plate, ensuring he did not go to sleep entirely hungry. Sadie patiently listened to Old Silas's rambling stories, cheerfully hearing the exact same ones over and over again, the specific way the very old naturally tell them as their memories fade. Sadie carefully washed his dirty things, diligently kept his little cast-iron stove burning warm against the chill, and tenderly held his trembling hand on the particularly bad nights when the pain was unbearable. And Sadie selflessly did all of this exhausting labor for a dying, forgotten old man who could give her absolutely nothing in return. No wages, no social advantage, nothing, because Sadie had never once in her entire life purposefully done a kindness just for what it would selfishly get her. Wyatt Hayes managed to see all of this profound kindness entirely by accident. One fateful evening, Wyatt had briefly ridden over to the dusty Lawson place on some routine business errand for his wealthy father, and he had clearly seen Sadie quietly walking out to Silas's isolated shack in the fading dusk, carefully balancing a covered plate of warm food. Curious, Wyatt had casually asked a young Lawson boy what that strange sight was all about, and the boy had simply shrugged dismissively and said, "Oh, that is strictly just Sadie. She stubbornly sits with Old Silas every single night and nobody actually knows why she bothers, seeing as he cannot even pay her any mind half the time anyway." And Wyatt Hayes had remained perfectly still, sitting atop his horse in the gathering shadows, and silently watched Sadie Miller carry her very own desperately needed supper out to an entirely forgotten, dying man. Suddenly, something profound and deeply moving had instantly turned over inside. Wyatt's chest and the mental ledger of her true worth had permanently begun, even though Wyatt would not have officially called it that at the time. The second monumental entry in this secret account came just a few short weeks later during a bitterly cold spell. There was a desperate, displaced family slowly passing through the rugged county, an incredibly poor family known as the Weavers, who were actually worse off even than the struggling Lawsons themselves. It was a weary man, his exhausted wife, and three incredibly thin, shivering children huddled together in a completely broken-down wooden wagon, desperately heading further west to find something that probably would not even be there when they finally arrived. They cautiously stopped at the Lawson place just to beg for a little drinking water, and Sadie Miller, immediately seeing those three remarkably thin, hungry children, quickly rushed into the tiny, cramped space that was hers. She emerged moments later with real, sustaining food, significantly more than she could ever realistically spare from her own rations, and fiercely pressed it upon that desperate family, absolutely refusing to take no for an answer. And when the smallest, most fragile child, a tiny little girl, violently shivered in the freezing evening cold, Sadie Miller unhesitatingly took off her very own thick winter coat, tenderly wrapped it around the trembling child, and firmly told the weeping mother to keep it forever. Wyatt Hayes just happened to be there again, completing another of his father's endless errands, and Wyatt stood in absolute awe as he watched Sadie give her only warm coat to a total stranger's child, and willingly go freezing cold herself. And Wyatt deliberately added a second unforgettable entry to the meticulous account he was keeping. The third beautiful entry involved the slow, gentle boy named Barnaby. There was a sweet-natured boy in the county named Barnaby who was considered simple, whose delicate mind had sadly never grown up the way his large body did, and who the other cruel young folks endlessly mocked without a shred of mercy. The exact terrible way the young can often be so ruthlessly cruel to those who are different. And Wyatt had personally seen, on significantly more than one occasion, Sadie Miller step directly and bravely between the frightened Barnaby and his aggressive tormentors. She was incredibly quiet but fiercely protective, and she deliberately took Barnaby under her protective wing at all the crowded church socials. Sadie purposefully danced with him in the center of the room, so he would never have to stand alone in the shadows, and she consistently treated him with a profound, plain kindness that asked absolutely nothing of him and expected completely nothing in return. Barnaby immediately lit up like a brilliant oil lamp whenever Sadie was anywhere near him, because Sadie Miller was unequivocally the one single person in the entire territory who genuinely treated Barnaby like a completely whole valuable person. Wyatt Hayes clearly saw all of this transpire and permanently added a third entry, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, because once Wyatt consciously started watching her, he quickly realized that Sadie did this specific kind of magnificent thing constantly, without any hesitation, without any grand display, and as completely naturally as drawing breath. And here is exactly what puzzled Wyatt Hayes the absolute most, and what ultimately drew him in the deepest to her beautiful soul. Sadie Miller legitimately did not know she was doing anything remotely remarkable or worthy of any praise. Wyatt could see this fact perfectly plain. To all the wealthy dowry girls in town, a single public act of minor charity was a grand thing to be carefully arranged, publicly witnessed, and permanently remembered. Essentially, a calculated deposit in the ongoing account of their own glowing social reputation. But to Sadie Miller, quietly sitting, with old Silas in the dark, warmly clothing a complete stranger's freezing child, and fiercely shielding poor Barnaby from bullies, were absolutely not considered acts of grand charity at all. They were simply just exactly what a decent person naturally did in this harsh world. Sadie no more kept a running count of her daily kindnesses than she consciously kept a count of her own heartbeats. She would have been genuinely, utterly puzzled to ever hear anyone refer to her daily actions as profound kindnesses. To Sadie Miller, moving mountains for other people was simply just another normal Tuesday. So, quite naturally and inevitably, Wyatt Hayes fell deeply, irrevocably in love. It was absolutely not the calculated way he was supposedly supposed to fall in love, concerning himself with vast acreage, heavy dowries, and perfectly matched wealthy estates. Wyatt completely fell in love with a profoundly poor, hard-working orphan hand who practically owned exactly one faded blue shawl and constantly gave away absolutely everything else she ever managed to acquire. He loved a woman who honestly did not even know she was doing a single thing worth anyone noticing. And so, Wyatt Hayes slowly began, meticulously over those 2 long years, to quietly court Sadie Miller in his own steady, unassuming way. He constantly found clever reasons to be working near her, offering to help with the heaviest chores, and always making sure to walk her safely home through the fields after the lively, church socials. And Sadie, who had strictly done her brutal societal sum and always came out firmly at zero, absolutely could not, for the very life of her, understand what a wealthy, prominent man exactly like Wyatt Hayes could possibly want with a completely destitute girl exactly like her, because that ingrained belief was the undeniable trouble at the core of it all. Every single time Wyatt's romantic attention became clear enough that Sadie could absolutely no longer pretend not to see it, Sadie would gently but firmly pull back and painfully do her brutal sum out loud for him to hear. I have absolutely nothing to offer you, Wyatt. You truly should court a proper girl with good land. You are completely throwing yourself away on a poor hand with empty pockets, she would say. Sadie said various painful versions of this exact phrase many times over those passing 2 years, and every single time she uttered it, Wyatt Hayes desperately wanted to physically shake her or forcefully sit her down in a chair and loudly read her the incredibly rich account he had been so carefully keeping, the massive, irrefutable account that definitively told a completely different, beautiful story about her true, immense worth. But Wyatt patiently held off, keeping his silence for just a little while longer. Wyatt was steadily waiting, although he probably could not have articulated exactly what he was waiting for at the time. He was actually waiting, as it miraculously turned out, for the absolute final entry to present itself. He was waiting for the single monumental entry that would finally, undeniably make the emotional account so incredibly large and overwhelmingly wealthy that it would be entirely impossible for even the stubborn Sadie to ever deny its profound truth. And that final beautiful entry was just on the horizon, waiting to change both of their lives forever. The absolute last entry in Wyatt Hayes' secret ledger was incredibly hard, and it ultimately cost the selfless Sadie Miller the very last precious thing she proudly owned in this world, and it tragically happened during the bitter, freezing winter of that second year. Old Silas finally died that unforgiving winter. He passed away in his freezing little shack at the edge of the property, but he thankfully died with Sadie Miller warmly holding his frail hand in the dark, because Sadie had faithfully gone out into the freezing cold to patiently sit with him that final night, exactly the way she had diligently gone out there nearly every single night for 2 solid years. And old Silas, at the very bitter end of his long road, had absolutely almost nothing of value to leave anyone behind, primarily because he had lived his entire existence and would ultimately die as a deeply poor, entirely forgotten ranch hand. But dying men always bring inevitable burying costs, and there was the serious question of providing a decent burial, a proper stone marker, and a real church service, rather than the shameful pauper's hole in the forgotten corner of the county ground that an old, useless hand would ordinarily be thrown into. The strict Lawson family was absolutely not going to pay good money for a proper burial for an old, broken hand who could no longer work the fields. That was simply the cold, hard arithmetic of the unforgiving territory. And so old Silas, who had loyally worked 40 grueling years and never hurt a single soul, and who told his gentle, rambling stories to anyone who would listen, was tragically going to go into the frozen ground completely unmarked and entirely unmourned, the exact tragic way the poor and forgotten so often did out there on the plains. Except that the stubborn, fiercely compassionate Sadie Miller would absolutely not have it happen that way, not on her watch. Sadie Miller naturally had absolutely no money of her own, of course. Sadie had never possessed real money in her entire grueling life, but Sadie crucially had exactly one single thing of true value in all the wide world. Sadie had her late mother's beautiful blue shawl, and the determined Sadie Miller carefully took that delicate blue shawl, the absolute only fine thing she rightfully owned, the only tangible thing she still had of the loving mother who died when she was merely 6 years old, and Sadie bravely carried it all the way into the town of Bozeman. She walked into a dry goods store and quietly sold it to a wealthy shopkeeper's wife who had always openly admired its fine craftsmanship, trading it for exactly enough money to generously give old Silas a highly decent, respectful burial and a real, heavy stone with his full name properly cut into it, so he would never be forgotten. You must remember the profound significance of that blue shawl, the one truly precious, irreplaceable thing Sadie Miller securely owned in all the harsh world, the absolute last physical remnant of her mother. Sadie unhesitatingly sold it just to bury a completely forgotten old man, who could obviously never know she had done it and could entirely never ever thank her for the incredible sacrifice. That specific action is the monumental entry right there. That is the singular entry that permanently finished the account. Because a wealthy person who gives away spare money she does not even miss is simply generous. A destitute person who willingly gives away the absolute one irreplaceable thing she legally owns for the pure sake of a dead man who cannot even know about it is something a great deal rarer than just generous, and there is absolutely no word for it in Sadie Miller's depressing ledger of dowries and land. But there is only one beautiful word for it in Wyatt Hayes's. Wyatt Hayes managed to find out all about the traded shawl completely by accident, the exact same way he had always found out about absolutely everything Sadie quietly did, because Sadie legitimately never told a single soul about her good deeds. Wyatt learned it directly from the chatty shopkeeper's wife in Bozeman, who casually mentioned in passing what an incredibly lovely blue shawl she had recently bought off the poor Miller girl, and what an absolute crying shame it was that the poor thing had been forced to sell her only family keepsake. And did Wyatt happen to know she had selflessly used all the money to bury old Silas proper? And Wyatt Hayes just stood there frozen in that mercantile shop and profoundly understood that the secret account he had been so meticulously keeping for 2 long years had just mathematically reached a sum so incredibly large and overwhelmingly valuable that it could absolutely no longer be ignored by anyone, and that the agonizing time for patient waiting was permanently over. But right before Wyatt could confidently act on this revelation, Sadie painfully did her own brutal sum one final, devastating time, and it very nearly ended things before they could truly begin. Because that exact same bitter winter, at a crowded community church gathering, one of the wealthy county matrons, a Mrs. Sterling who fancied herself a highly skilled matchmaker and who had a daughter of her own with prime land and a hefty dowry, took it upon herself to speak terribly plainly to Sadie Miller. Mrs. Sterling aggressively drew Sadie aside into a quiet corner and explicitly told her, in that intensely kind, sugary, dripping voice people always use for saying incredibly cruel things, that Sadie really ought not to continue encouraging young Wyatt Hayes. Mrs. Sterling insisted that it was simply not fair to the ambitious boy, that a destitute girl with absolutely nothing to her name had no business whatsoever tying down a prominent young man of Wyatt's grand prospects, and that the only truly decent thing, the genuinely kind thing to do, would be for Sadie to permanently step aside and let Wyatt marry a proper girl who could actually bring something valuable to the match. Sadie Miller, who had spent her entire existence being nothing but kind to others, quietly heard this venomous speech and genuinely believed it was an act of kindness, because it agreed exactly, perfectly with the brutal sum she had always mathematically done on herself. So, a heartbroken Sadie bravely went to Wyatt on the exact evening this story originally began with, fully meaning to honorably step aside for his own sake. Sadie had firmly decided that the truly generous thing, the ultimately kind thing, was to completely release Wyatt Hayes, so he could marry someone who could bring him vast land and real money, someone society deemed truly worthy of him, and to completely take herself permanently out of his bright way. Sadie had somehow managed to tragically turn even this devastating heartbreak into an ultimate act of giving. You see, willingly giving up her own deep heart's singular wish, strictly for what she genuinely believed was Wyatt's ultimate good. That is exactly how incredibly deep the wrong sum went inside her soul. Sadie simply could not ever imagine she had anything of value to offer, so she bravely offered the absolute only thing she thought she possessed, which was her permanent absence from his life. And that is exactly when Sadie Miller looked down at her rough, empty hands and sighed heavily and said those tragic words, "I have nothing to offer you, Wyatt. Nothing at all." And that is precisely when Wyatt Hayes, who had been meticulously keeping his profound account for 2 years and had just recently heard the absolute final entry read back to him in a busy shop in Bozeman, finally decisively decided that Sadie Miller was going to sit down and hear the entire comprehensive account read back to her out loud, entry by specific entry, whether she was entirely ready to believe it or not. "Sit down right now, Sadie," Wyatt Hayes commanded gently but firmly. "You have repeatedly read me your depressing account of yourself for 2 long years now, relentlessly listing all the material things you do, not have, Now you're going to sit perfectly still and listen to mine, because I have been diligently keeping one too, and mine is a great deal longer and richer than yours, and it is finally time you heard it out loud." And Sadie Miller, too incredibly surprised and taken aback to even argue, slowly sat down on a nearby wooden bench, and Wyatt Hayes began to read her the invisible ledger. "Entry 1, Wyatt said clearly. "Old Silas, for 2 whole years you carried your very own supper out in the freezing dark to a dying man who could give you absolutely nothing in return. Every single evening, after a brutally full day's work in the fields, when you could have easily rested your bones. Absolutely nobody asked you to do it. Nobody even knew you did it, except when I saw it by complete accident. That is absolutely not nothing, Sadie. Where I come from, that is just about the largest, most profound thing a person can possibly do." "Entry 2, Wyatt went on, and his deep voice was incredibly steady, low, and absolutely certain of its truth. "The Weaver family, passing desperately through the county. 3 incredibly thin children shivering in a broken-down wooden wagon. You instantly gave them precious food you absolutely could not spare, and you literally took the only warm coat off your very own back, and you willingly went freezing cold yourself, and you honestly thought so incredibly little of it that you have probably completely forgotten it even happened by now. I assure you, I have not forgotten it for a single day. Entry 3, poor Barnaby. Every single church social for years on end, you have bravely stood directly between that sweet boy and the cruel ones who mock him without mercy, and you danced with him so he would never have to stand alone, and you constantly treated him like a completely whole man, when the entire rest of the county treated him like a pathetic joke. Do you possess any idea what that is truly worth, Sadie? To Barnaby, it is worth absolutely everything in the world. To me, it is worth significantly more than any massive dowry or acreage in this entire territory." Sadie Miller sat incredibly still on the bench, and her tired eyes had slowly begun to fill with hot tears, because she had never once in her entire life heard these quiet things named out loud, and hearing them explicitly named was doing something monumental to the stubborn sum she had carried her whole life. "And entry 4, Wyatt said, his voice growing much softer now, filled with raw emotion. "The blue shawl, your mother's delicate shawl, the absolute only thing you owned in all the wide world, the very last precious thing you still had of her memory. You sold it, Sadie. You sold the very last of your dear mother just to buy a completely forgotten old man, a highly decent grave and a heavy stone with his name permanently cut into it, and you selflessly did it fully knowing he could never, ever thank you, knowing absolutely nobody would ever know about it. Knowing it would personally cost you the one single precious thing you possessed. I found out entirely by accident, the exact way I always find out absolutely everything you do, because you legitimately never tell a single soul." Wyatt's own voice was noticeably rough and thick with tears now. "You sat there just a moment ago and explicitly told me you have absolutely nothing to offer me. Sadie Miller, you have spent 2 full years offering absolutely everything you have to absolutely everyone who needed it, and you have consistently done it so quietly and so constantly that you cannot even see it yourself. You have been incredibly rich this entire time. You simply just kept your account in the wrong column." Sadie Miller buried her weeping face deeply in her calloused hands, and for the absolute first time in this whole story, Sadie truly wept, because the lifelong sum she had carried her entire existence, the painful sum that always came out at 0, was being violently torn up right in front of her and entirely rewritten, and it was almost significantly more than her fragile heart could bear to accept. "But those simple things are nothing," Sadie protested weakly through her trembling hands. "Those are simply just things a decent person naturally does. Absolutely anybody would do them." "No, Sadie," Wyatt said firmly, and he gently but resolutely took her rough hands down from her tear-stained face so she would be forced to look directly at him. "That is exactly the entire point. Anybody would absolutely not do them. Almost nobody in this world actually does them, and you do them without even consciously noticing, which is definitively the rarest, most beautiful thing of all, because it means they naturally come from something deeply real inside you, and not from selfishly wanting any social credit. This county foolishly measures a bride by her land, her dowry, and her family name. It is an absolute fool's measure, Sadie. I have carefully watched the wealthy girls with all three of those things, and there is absolutely nothing behind their cold eyes. And I have steadily watched you, with absolutely none of it. You willingly give away your own winter coat, your own meager supper, and your own mother's precious shawl, and I absolutely would not trade you for every single sprawling ranch in Montana. You keep stubbornly saying you have nothing to offer. Sadie Miller, you definitively have the kindest heart in all of Montana, and a genuinely kind heart is the absolute only real fortune that never ever runs out and never lies. Marry me, not so I can act like I am saving you, but so I can spend the rest of my entire life keeping the absolute only account of you that ever told the real truth. And Sadie Miller, the destitute orphan girl who had rigorously done her mathematical sum and come out precisely at 0 every single time for 25 long years, looked deeply at Wyatt Hayes, and finally, mercifully, allowed herself to fully believe a completely different number. It was undeniably the hardest mental thing she had ever done, significantly harder than sitting with the actively dying, and far harder than selling her mother's shawl, because it required entirely unlearning the absolute one thing she had been the most definitively sure of, which was her own inherent worthlessness. But Wyatt had read the beautiful account so perfectly plainly, entry by undeniable entry, that even the stubborn Sadie could no longer argue with the massive sum. Yes, Sadie whispered softly into the evening air. Yes, Wyatt, though I honestly still do not half believe you. And Wyatt Hayes smiled broadly and said, that is perfectly all right. I will happily read you the account every single day of our lives until you finally do. I've got a whole lifetime of entries saved up in my head, and I'm continuously adding beautiful new ones all the time. Sadie Miller happily married Wyatt Hayes in the vibrant spring, in the beautiful little wooden church near Bozeman, and the entire county eagerly came to celebrate, including sweet Barnaby, who openly wept with pure happiness through the entire service, and including old Silas's grave, in a manner of speaking, because his highly respectable stone with his full name deeply cut into it stood proudly in the churchyard where absolutely everyone could see it, bought with a blue shawl, a beautiful fact that a few observant people in that county finally knew and would absolutely never forget. And here is the incredibly touching thing Wyatt Hayes secretly did, very quietly, right before the wedding day, because Wyatt had undoubtedly learned his quiet, generous ways directly from steadily watching Sadie. Wyatt covertly rode back to the shopkeeper's wife in Bozeman, and Wyatt firmly bought back Sadie's mother's delicate blue shawl, and he willingly paid a very good deal more for it than it had originally sold for, and the shopkeeper's wife, who was absolutely not a bad woman at heart, let it go extremely gladly once she fully understood the beautiful context. And on their joyous wedding morning, Wyatt Hayes lovingly gave Sadie Miller back her mother's cherished shawl, the absolute last remnant of her mother, the one truly precious thing she had so selflessly sold just to bury a completely forgotten man. You must remember the blue shawl, the absolute only fine thing Sadie owned in all the wide world. It miraculously came back to her on her wedding day, directly, from the loving hands of the man who had silently watched her give it away, and who perfectly understood exactly what that sacrifice had cost her soul. Sadie tightly held that recovered shawl to her chest, and entirely could not speak through her tears, and Wyatt softly said, "You selflessly gave away the last of your mother for a complete stranger's grave. A woman who would willingly do that should absolutely never have to go through life without her mother's shawl. It is permanently yours. Again, Sadie, and it is always staying yours." And Sadie Miller wept deeply again, the incredibly good healing kind of weeping this time, and proudly wore the vibrant blue shawl at her very own wedding. They had an incredibly long, immensely good life together, Sadie and Wyatt, on the sprawling ranch in the Montana Territory. And Sadie absolutely never did stop giving things away to those in need, because it was simply exactly who she fundamentally was, and Wyatt never once tried to stop her, because he had married her precisely and entirely for it. The Hayes Ranch eventually became universally known over the long years as the safe place a desperate person could always go when they had absolutely nowhere else to turn. It was the warm place where a starving family got thoroughly fed, and a lost soul found safe shelter, and a worn-out old hand got a highly decent grave. Because the kind woman of that grand ranch permanently kept an open, generous hand, the exact same way she always had, since she was poor, and now she finally had the abundant financial means to perfectly match her massive heart. And sometimes, of a quiet evening, Wyatt Hayes would find Sadie tightly wrapped in her mother's blue shawl, and he would comfortably sit beside her, and Sadie would say, still just a little wondering after all the passing years, "I truly never did have anything to offer you, Wyatt." And Wyatt Hayes would smile the exact same slow, incredibly sure smile he had smiled that very first, defining evening. And he would look at her and say, "Sadie Miller, you have offered me the absolute kindest heart in all of Montana every single day of my life. I have been continuously keeping the account. It is undeniably the richest ledger in the entire state, and it has absolutely never once run short. Thank you so much for listening to the end of this beautiful story. I hope this tale serves as a gentle reminder to all of us that true wealth isn't measured by what we keep in our pockets or the status we hold in society. It's measured by the quiet kindnesses we offer when nobody is watching, and the love we freely give to those who need it most. We all have so much more to offer the world than we often realize. If this story touched your heart, and you would love to hear more uplifting and powerful narratives, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel.